A vicar's teaspoon goes missing, and what it uncovers chills the entire parish. Welcome to Nuits Criminelles. I'm your host, Elio. This mystery-loving community amazes me. Drop a comment and share where you're listening from. Your messages truly bring this channel to life. Let's begin. The afternoon sun bathed the village green of St Mildred's in a golden hush, as though even the weather itself had agreed to be on its best behavior for Mrs. Banbury Scott's annual garden party. Tables adorned with embroidered linens bore an almost absurd abundance of sponge cakes, seed scones, and the slightly infamous gooseberry fool that had, on one occasion, sent the colonel into an alarming digestive retreat. Teacups clinked, parasols bobbed, and well-polished shoes trod carefully over croquet wickets and picnic rugs. Miss Marple, sitting a discreet distance from the excitement beneath a pale blue sun hat, sipped her tea without fanfare. She was placed, as always, just far enough from the main action to appear merely a harmless fixture, dear Miss Marple, with her lace gloves and fondness for lemon drizzle. Yet her pale eyes, sharp behind their spectacles, missed very little. The vicar, the Reverend Lionel Arbuthnot, was at the center of the gathering, as genial and bumbling as ever. A tall man with an unfortunate tendency to gesticulate with his teacup, he was currently embroiled in conversation with Mrs. Alicia Drake, a widow recently returned from Kenya with rather too many opinions and rather too few manners. Mrs. Drake was holding forth on the superiority of colonial administration to anything these dear little village committees could achieve. Elsewhere, the usual characters made their appearances. Colonel Faraday, stiff-backed and full of stories about India that had grown no less tiresome with repetition. Young Isabel Hartley, flushed and laughing, who was often seen on the arm of Charles Denham, the vicar's newly arrived and suspiciously handsome nephew. And then there was Mrs. Ridgway, the pharmacist's wife, with her unpleasantly tight-lipped smile and a nose for misfortune. The only person conspicuously absent was Miss Lydia Masters, the local schoolmistress, whose punctuality was second only to her devotion to the vicar's choir. It was only when the cucumber sandwiches were being passed around a second time that someone, Mrs. Banbury Scott herself, remarked upon the absence. Oh, how odd. Lydia said she'd be bringing her famous elderflower cordial. Do you suppose she's taken ill? The vicar, brow furrowed, excused himself to pop over and check, and a general murmur of agreement followed. No one truly believed something was wrong. People were late all the time, weren't they? And yet, 10 minutes later, the vicar returned, pale beneath his ruddy complexion, the teaspoon from his own kitchen trembling in his hand. There's something that matters, he stammered. I found Miss Masters in her sitting room, quite dead. There was a stunned silence. Miss Marple, still seated and seemingly unmoved, reached delicately for her napkin and dabbed the corner of her lips. Poor dear Lydia, she said softly. And yet I do wonder why she was holding a pair of gardening gloves in her left hand when she hadn't a garden to tend to. No one heard her. Already the whispers had begun. St Mildred's was the sort of place where even the gossip travelled at a gentler pace. The postman, Mr. Peaver, often remarked that news in the village moved only slightly faster than his bicycle, though in this instance it would seem even his wheels were outpaced. By the time the vicar returned from Lydia Masters' cottage, his alarmed announcement had turned the garden party into a collection of stunned silences and muffled exclamations. Tea was forgotten, cakes left untouched, and someone, Mrs. Ridgway no doubt, had already started whispering behind her gloved hand before the vicar had finished speaking. A heart attack, perhaps, ventured Colonel Faraday, drawing himself up with military certainty. Always said Miss Masters was too thin. Never trust a woman who eats like a bird. Not enough meat on her to stand the heat. Or nerves, added Mrs. Ridgway quickly, her tone tinged with relish. She had that look about her lately. You know the one who's troubled. Pale, edgy. Oh, I noticed it, always humming to herself like a kettle just before boiling over. It's too early to speculate, the vicar said, though his quavering voice suggested he'd done nothing but speculate since discovering the body. Dr. Pendle will be along shortly. I sent Charles to fetch him at once. Charles Denham, his neat brown hair already windblown, had taken off on foot before anyone could stop him. Isabel Hartley watched him go with wide eyes, her slender fingers twisting the silver bracelet on her wrist. She said nothing, but her anxious posture and stiff jaw suggested more than a passing concern. Mrs. Banbury Scott attempted to regain control with the imperiousness that came naturally to a woman whose family had once owned half of Devonshire. Ladies and gentlemen, I suggest we not abandon our manners along with our sandwiches. A terrible event has occurred, yes, but surely standing around gawking like townsfolk at a theatre fire won't help anything. Despite her words, she made no move to stop the steady dispersal of guests. The garden party was over in all but name, and even the most stalwart tea drinkers found their way toward the gates, speaking in hushed tones as they retreated. Only Miss Marple remained seated, her teacup empty and forgotten beside her. Her expression was unreadable, eyes following the retreating guests, the disheveled vicar, and the distant speck of Charles running toward the doctor's cottage. It was, perhaps, a trick of the light or a trick of Miss Marple herself that her gentle smile never quite reached her eyes. A few hours later, the village had transformed. What had once been a sunlit celebration now seemed cast in grey. Curtains twitched at the edges of windows, and the bell at St. Mildred's rang out a solitary, sombre note that rippled through cobbled lanes and neatly trimmed hedgerows. At the Primrose Tea Room, the news was already well stewed, along with Mrs. Moffat's overboiled Earl Grey. 3 women sat at the corner table nearest the lace-curtained window. Mrs. Ridgway, of course, was accompanied by the florid Mrs. Hemmings and the very round Mrs. Finch, who had not missed a village scandal in 2 decades. "Well, I still say it doesn't sit right," Mrs. Hemmings muttered, peering into her tea as though it might reveal some deeper truth. "A woman like Lydia Masters doesn't just up and die during a garden party. Not without cause." "She never seemed right to me," said Mrs. Ridgway, smoothing down the already immaculate front of her skirt. "You know what I always say. Any woman over 30 who's never married has something to hide." "Oh, come now," said Mrs. Finch. "There are plenty of reasons not to marry." Maybe she was heartbroken or disappointed. She did always seem rather fond of the vicar, didn't she? The 3 women looked at one another in a moment of conspiratorial silence. "The vicar," Mrs. Hemmings gasped. "Don't be absurd. He wouldn't hurt a fly." "Perhaps not," Mrs. Ridgway allowed. "But love unreturned can drive people to peculiar behaviors." At that precise moment, the bell above the tea-room door tinkled gently, and in stepped Miss Marple. The ladies fell quiet, each unsure whether to include her or regard her as an interloper. Miss Marple, for her part, seemed entirely unaware of their hesitation. "Good afternoon, ladies," she said brightly. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Finch, always the more courteous of the 3. "Do join us. We were just, discussing the terrible business." "Such a dreadful thing," Miss Marple agreed, seating herself with the ease of someone used to slipping into conversations like a warm spoon in custard. Poor Miss Masters. Such a pity she didn't live to see the summer roses in full bloom. "She wasn't well," said Mrs. Hemmings with a sniff. "You could see it." "She'd been quieter of late," added Mrs. Finch, nodding thoughtfully. "A touch withdrawn." "Wouldn't you say?" "Withdrawn, perhaps," Miss Marple agreed. "But not unhappy. I saw her just 3 days ago, buying marmalade from Mr. Jellicoe. She looked quite well, unusually so, in fact. Rosy-cheeked. Cheerful." The 3 women glanced at one another. "Perhaps it came on suddenly," suggested Mrs. Ridgway. "A seizure of some sort." "Did she have a history?" asked Mrs. Finch. No, said Miss Marple, stirring her tea gently. In fact, I believe she was in excellent health for a woman of her age. No trouble with the heart, no dizzy spells, but I always thought it peculiar she wore gloves inside the house. Gloves? Mrs. Hemmings blinked. Oh, yes, Miss Marple continued casually. And so tight. Calfskin with pearl buttons. Unusual, don't you think? Especially for gardening indoors. She wasn't gardening indoors. Mrs. Ridgway scoffed. Don't be ridiculous. No, Miss Marple agreed softly. That's precisely what I thought. The silence returned, heavier this time. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Her eyes, soft and blue, gave nothing away. By the time she stepped back into the street, the shadows were beginning to lengthen across the cobbles. Dr. Pendle's car rumbled past, heading in the direction of the vicarage. A few boys in short trousers loitered near the sweet shop, pausing their game of marbles to stare at the doctor's vehicle. Back at her cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple set her gloves on the table and carefully opened the drawer of her writing desk. From it, she removed a small leather notebook and a fountain pen, pausing only to refill the ink. She did not write down names. Not yet. But she did make a short teaspoon. Gloves. Vicar's shaken, but not surprised. Check Lydia's garden. No visible signs of recent planting. Isabel's expression when Charles ran off. She placed the pen down and sat back, hands folded in her lap. It would not be long before the police arrived. No doubt the local constable would make a brave effort, bless him, and Dr. Pendle would issue some preliminary cause of death, naturally, most likely, unless something startling turned up in the examination. But Miss Marple had lived too long and seen too much to take such things at face value. People always thought of St. Mildred's as peaceful, quaint, and harmless. But peace, she thought, was often a very thin veil, and beneath it all manner of sins could fester, blooming like fungi in the dark. Outside, the church bell gave another slow toll, and in a neat little cottage with geraniums in the window, Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea and waited. The following morning dawned unusually still in St. Mildred's, as though the very air held its breath. Church Lane, typically bustling with dog walkers and market-bound villagers by 8 o'clock, remained eerily silent. A mist clung to the cobbled streets, and even the bird-song seemed subdued. At precisely 8:30, Constable Owen Briggs arrived at Miss Lydia Master's cottage for the second time in as many days, this time not alone. He was accompanied by Inspector Colin Arkwright from the county station in Much Barton. The inspector, a tall man with a sandpaper voice and an expression like sun-dried linen, had the faint air of someone who had spent too long behind a desk and not enough time among hedgerows and tea-shops. A cheerful little place, Arkwright remarked dryly as he stood at the white picket gate, glancing at the weathered stone facade and the rose trellis that framed the door, though not quite so cheerful inside, I expect. "No, sir," said Constable Briggs, fiddling nervously with his notebook. "I, secured the scene after the vicar found her. No sign of forced entry." The door was latched but not locked. Inspector Arkwright gave a grunt of acknowledgement and stepped inside. Lydia Master's cottage was as neat as a pin. Nothing appeared out of place, and the small front parlour retained the faint scent of lemon polish and lavender. It might have been any elderly woman's home, quiet, comforting, ordinary, were it not for the lifeless figure still slumped in the armchair by the cold hearth. Dr. Pendle stood beside the body, spectacles halfway down his nose, inspecting a clipboard with clinical detachment. "No external trauma," he said without looking up. "Rigors set in. Estimated time of death between 2 and 4 yesterday afternoon. Blood pressure was normal on her last visit. Cholesterol was reasonable, and there were no prior cardiac complaints. I'll need to confirm at the mortuary, of course, but I dare say it's not a natural cause. Found traces of something odd under her fingernails." "Odd?" Arkwright narrowed his eyes. a residue, chalky, possibly powdered gloves, or, well, we'll know more when we run tests. He stepped back and waved a hand vaguely over the corpse. No struggle, no bruising. If it was poison, it was subtle. Fast-acting, though. Look at her posture, still seated, eyes closed as if she dozed off during the service. Briggs cleared his throat. She was holding a pair of gloves, sir, in her left hand. Yes, the doctor replied. Calfskin. Quite elegant, really. Pity. Inspector Arkwright surveyed the room with a slow turn of his head. His eyes paused on a small table beside the armchair, upon which rested an empty teacup and a single silver teaspoon. The handle bore an ornate engraved cross, likely ecclesiastical silver. "Does this belong to the vicar?" he asked. "Possibly," said Briggs. He did say he made her tea himself. When she didn't show up to the party, he walked over to check. Found her like this. Arkwright frowned and made a note. Tea. Always tea. We really ought to train our villains to be more original. He turned to the constable. Send that cup and spoon for analysis, and check whether the vicar has any more like it. We need to confirm if that one came from his kitchen. Back on Church Lane, Miss Marple watched the inspector's car roll away from the cottage as she watered her geraniums. The air was already beginning to warm, and the scent of honeysuckle carried on the breeze. She did not hurry, nor did she appear particularly curious, yet her ears were keenly attuned to the low murmur of voices drifting from the direction of Lydia's garden gate. She resumed her pruning, glancing up just in time to see Charles Denham approaching from the footpath. He looked paler than usual, his movements clipped and restless. "Good morning, Mr. Denham," she called out gently. He started, clearly surprised to see her there, then offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Miss Marple. I didn't expect anyone to be up so early." "Oh, I find the early hours particularly revealing," she said pleasantly. "The world seems a touch more honest before everyone's had their breakfast." Charles gave a short laugh. "Yes, well, honest or not, I imagine there'll be plenty of talk today." He glanced toward Lydia's house, then back at the gravel path beneath his feet. "She was always very kind to me, you know, Miss Masters, ever since I arrived." "I imagine she was," Miss Marple said. She had a very generous spirit, though some might say she wore her disappointments heavily. Charles looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. "Disappointments?" "Well," Miss Marple replied with a vague wave of her gloved hand, "we all carry them, Mr. Denham. Some carry them in silence, others in song. Lydia was very fond of hymns, if you recall." He looked away. "I didn't really know her that well. Oh, few of us do truly know anyone, I think. But we often have impressions. Yours might be useful to the inspector." He shifted awkwardly and made an excuse about errands before moving quickly down the lane, leaving Miss Marple once more in her garden. By mid-morning, St. Mildred's was a humming hive of subdued speculation. At the grocer's, two old men argued over whether poison could be administered through lemon curd. At the post office, the younger Miss Harbottle insisted she had once seen Lydia crying on her way out of morning service, though her sister, rather tartly, suggested it had probably been due to hay fever. At the vicarage, Inspector Arkwright questioned Reverend Arbuthnot in the study, which was cluttered with hymnals and old parish ledgers. The vicar wrung his hands incessantly, clearly uncomfortable under scrutiny. "I only made the tea," he repeated. She liked her own blend. Brought it herself. "I simply boiled the kettle and poured it out." Arkwright studied him carefully. "She didn't seem distressed?" "No more than usual. She was a very private person." "Did you notice anything odd when you arrived?" The vicar hesitated, then spoke slowly. "Well, yes. Her front door was slightly ajar, though it's possible she left it that way expecting me. We often had little impromptu chats. She found the party overwhelming, she said. Arkwright nodded. And this teaspoon, you're certain it's from your set? I think so. It does have the parish engraving, but the church silver is kept in the vestry cabinet. I suppose I might have taken it home once and forgotten to return it. My nephew does help with the cleaning sometimes. Your nephew Arkwright, echoed Charles Denham. Yes, he's been visiting for the past 6 weeks. Arkwright made another note, then closed his notebook with a snap. I'll be speaking to him shortly. Outside, the village continued its quiet routine, but beneath its polished surface, nerves twitched and secrets simmered. In the small parlor of her cottage, Miss Marple had just set down her embroidery when there came a soft knock at the door. It was Isabel Hartley. She looked pale, her eyes rimmed with fatigue, and she held her handbag, with a grip that suggested it might otherwise escape. Miss Marple, she said in a trembling voice. May I come in? Miss Marple stepped aside. Of course, dear. Come and sit by the window. There's fresh tea if you'd like a cup. Isabel nodded, barely managing a smile. I think I saw something at the party. I didn't think it was important then. But now Miss Marple poured the tea, her hands steady as ever. Tell me everything, my dear. Everything you remember. Sometimes the smallest thing is what matters most. Outside, the mist had lifted, but the shadows were just beginning to form. The sun had climbed to its mid-morning perch, casting crisp shadows along the brick walls of St. Mildred's, but despite the warmth in the air, the village held an uneasy stillness. The usual rhythms, post-deliveries, garden sweeping, and the muffled clang of kettles were all present, yet somehow muffled. It was like the entire village was waiting for something, or someone. At Miss Marple's cottage, Isabel Hartley sat with her tea cooling untouched in her lap. Her shoulders were drawn up tight, her hands clenched around the delicate china cup. She was not a naturally nervous girl, but today she seemed brittle, as if the gentlest prod might send her shattering. It was just a moment, Isabel began, her voice low, her eyes fixed on the rim of her teacup. During the garden party. Everyone was milling about, and I was helping Mrs. Banbury Scott set the silver trays on the buffet table. I happened to look across the lawn, and I saw Charles. He was speaking with Miss Masterson. Not speaking exactly, it looked like they were arguing. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. She merely continued threading her needle through the hem of her embroidery, her motions calm and deliberate. Arguing? She asked gently, as if coaxing a bird out of hiding. Isabel nodded. I couldn't hear them, of course. But his face wasn't like him. He looked angry. And Miss Masters, she seemed upset. I thought it odd, but I convinced myself it was nothing. I mean, Charles wouldn't. Her voice trailed off into silence. Miss Marple gave a slight nod, setting down her embroidery. Young men do get flustered, especially when older women offer them unwelcome advice. I don't suppose you heard what the disagreement was about. Number, but I saw Miss Masters walks away alone not long after. She didn't return to the party. And Charles went toward the vicarage, looking rather pale. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully out the window, where a pair of doves had settled on the garden wall. Did you mention this to the inspector? Isabel shook her head quickly. Number I didn't want to get Charles into trouble. It was probably nothing at all. Miss Marple's tone remained mild. Trouble, my dear, often begins as nothing at all. Not long after Isabel left, still pale, still unsure. Constable Briggs came up the path to Miss Marple's gate. He touched his cap respectfully. Morning, Miss Marple. I don't mean to bother you, but Inspector Arkwright sent me round. Thought you might have heard something. Seen something. Miss Marple invited him in with a smile and offered him a biscuit with his tea. Briggs accepted both with a gratitude that bordered on reverence. I suppose you're all narrowing things down, she asked mildly. Well, said Briggs, pausing to brush crumbs from his trousers. The inspector's got his eye on Charles Denham. It seems the vicar's nephew hasn't been entirely honest. Turns out he knew Miss Masters longer than he let on. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Oh, met her before he came to stay in St Mildred's. They crossed paths in London 2 years ago. She was visiting a cousin in Chelsea. Apparently she helped him out of a bit of a financial pickle. Small loan, not declared. He promised to pay it back, but never did. Miss Marple's brows lifted, but she said nothing. Briggs, encouraged, continued. The inspector thinks Miss Masters may have pressed him about the money, possibly threatened to tell the vicar. That could explain the argument Isabel Hartley mentioned. So the young lady told him after all, murmured Miss Marple. Briggs looked startled. She came to you first? She was troubled, understandably so. Briggs nodded, leaning forward. There's more, Miss Marple, about the teaspoon. Now her interest sharpened ever so slightly. The one found with her teacup? Briggs lowered his voice, although there was no one around to hear. It doesn't match the others. The vicar showed us the church set. It's nearly identical, but there's a slight difference in the engraving. Finer lines. The one from Miss Masters' cup is not part of the set. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. So it was deliberately placed. Could be. Or it came from somewhere else entirely. Either way, someone's gone to a great deal of effort to confuse things. Briggs rose, clearly anxious to return with something useful for the inspector. Miss Marple saw him to the door and watched him disappear down the lane, his boots crunching on the gravel. That afternoon, Inspector Arkwright summoned Charles Denham to the vicarage study for a formal interview. Charles arrived looking drawn, his collar askew and a smear of ink on his cuff, clear signs of a restless mind. I understand you were acquainted with Miss Masters. Prior to your visit here, Arkwright began without ceremony. Charles hesitated. Yes, I met her through mutual acquaintances. She was kind to me once. I needed a bit of money and she offered a small loan. I didn't think it was important at the time. Important enough to argue about at the garden party. Charles stiffened. We exchanged words. She mentioned the loan. She said she hadn't forgotten. But I swear, I never threatened her. Did you repay the debt? No, he admitted. But it wasn't large. She said she didn't mind. Yet she brought it up again. Yes, but not angrily. More as a reminder. Arkwright tapped his pen against the edge of his notebook. And you last saw her when? When she walked off from the party. I didn't follow her. I went back to the vicarage. Arkwright regarded him for a long moment. One last question. Do you recognize this spoon? He placed the silver teaspoon in front of Charles. Charles leaned forward. It looks like the ones from the church. But I don't remember using that one. Miss Masters' cup contained traces of something suspicious. If this spoon was used deliberately, it might suggest premeditation. Charles paled visibly. I didn't poison her, Inspector. I wouldn't even know how. The inspector closed his notebook but said nothing. It was clear the young man was not yet cleared. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hedgerows and the village turned to supper and shadows, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the church. She found Reverend Arbuthnot in the vestry, polishing brass candlesticks with unconscious devotion. Oh, Miss Marple, he said, flustered but warm. Terrible business, terrible. I can scarcely believe it. Lydia was a pillar. Not always cheerful, but always steadfast. I know, Miss Marple replied gently. A woman of quiet conviction. But tell me, Reverend, has anything gone missing from the vestry of late? He paused, cloth in hand. Missing? A silver teaspoon, perhaps? He blinked. Well, now that you mention it, one of the set's gone astray. I noticed just after Easter, but assumed it was misplaced. We have a few visitors, you know. And I confess, I'm not the most vigilant custodian. Miss Marple nodded. Thank you, Reverend. You've been most helpful. She walked home under the first twinkling stars. the night air cool on her cheeks. There was something about Charles Denham's story that didn't quite sit right. Too sincere in places, too vague in others. And yet there was something else. Something smaller, almost incidental. She returned to her writing desk and opened her notebook once more. Charles. Debt. Denied spoon. Spoon, mismatch in engraving. Missing from vestry. Lydia. Argument, left party alone. She paused, pen poised. Who would notice the difference in silver? Who would care? Miss Marple set her pen down and, in the lamplight, allowed herself the smallest of smiles. The village believed the police had their man, but Miss Marple, as ever, was not so sure. The following day broke with a restless wind blowing over the thatched rooftops of St Mildred's, rustling the trees in the churchyard and sending the scent of wild thyme and chimney smoke swirling through the lanes. It was the kind of wind that made villagers mutter about changes in the air and kept cats close to doorsteps. Miss Marple, as was her custom, rose early. She had always found the hours before breakfast the most fertile for thinking. The mind, unburdened by the chatter of the day, could wander freely. And today it wandered persistently back to that teaspoon. She had seen many cases turn on such small things. A misplaced button, a frayed hem, a change in handwriting. These were often the footprints of guilt, barely visible unless one knew where to look. And the ornate, mismatched, and very much out-of-place teaspoon was one such footprint. After a breakfast of a boiled egg and toast, Miss Marple pulled on her walking shoes and made her way toward the vicarage, where she had arranged to speak with Mrs. Weatherby, the housekeeper. Mrs. Weatherby was a compact woman in her 50s with a brisk manner and arms that seemed made for rolling dough or wrestling laundry into submission. She had been with the Reverend Arbuthnot for nearly 10 years, and while she never meddled, there was little that escaped her notice. "Morning, Miss Marple," she greeted, wiping her hands on her apron. "The inspector's been in and out all morning again. Poor Reverend did not have a minute's peace." "I won't trouble him," Miss Marple assured her kindly. "But I did wonder if I might have a look at the vicar's tea service. The silver, I mean. I have an interest in church pieces. My father collected ecclesiastical oddments, you see." Mrs. Weatherby eyed her suspiciously for half a moment, but Miss Marple's reputation for harmless curiosity was well established. "Nothing much to look at," the housekeeper muttered as she led the way to the pantry, where a polished oak cabinet stood against the wall, just the regular set. "The Reverend keeps the church silver locked up in the vestry cabinet, but there are a few odds and ends here." She opened the cabinet to reveal a modest collection of 6 cups, matching saucers, and a row of silver teaspoons neatly aligned in a velvet-lined drawer. Miss Marple bent slightly to inspect them. She lifted one of the spoons, holding it delicately between thumb and forefinger. The engraving was familiar, an ornate cross, finely done, each line crisp and symmetrical. Then she took out another spoon and compared the two. This one was nearly identical, but the cross was thicker, the detail coarser. "How odd," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Weatherby looked over her shoulder. "Something wrong?" "Oh, not at all," Miss Marple said lightly, placing the spoons back. "But I do think the silversmith who made these had a heavier hand." Mrs. Weatherby chuckled. "Wouldn't surprise me. That second set was donated by Mrs. Ellingham, who is retired and now lives in Bath. Said they were practically church quality. Never liked the feel of them myself. A bit off balance." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, that's just it." She thanked Mrs. Weatherby and made her way back along the lane, her thoughts circling ever tighter around the mystery of the spoon. The set in the pantry did not match the one found beside Miss Master's teacup, nor did it match the church silver, which the Reverend had claimed to keep locked. So if the teaspoon came from neither the vicarage nor the vestry, where had it come from? That question followed her all the way to Mr. Jellicoe's shop, where she paused not for groceries but for gossip, which, in such places, was offered more freely than sugar. "I do wish you'd heard the ruckus earlier," Mrs. Hemmings whispered to her as she browsed the biscuit tins. Inspector Arkwright stopped young Charles in the square this morning and asked him about a missing pair of gloves, right there in front of everyone. You'd have thought the boy had stolen the church bell. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Gloves?" "Lydia's," Mrs. Hemmings said, lowering her voice further. Apparently, the ones she was found holding were too small for her. Fancy that. Doesn't even make sense. Unless, of course, they were someone else's. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind spinning threads together. Later that afternoon, she took a detour through the churchyard and found herself outside the cottage of Dr. Pendle. A modest place with ivy climbing the stonework and a garden of medicinal herbs in orderly rows. It had always appealed to Miss Marple's sense of practicality. Dr. Pendle was in his garden, trimming lavender, and greeted her with polite surprise. "Miss Marple, good day to you. I suppose you've come about the case?" "Only to satisfy a passing curiosity," she replied, "about those gloves Miss Masters was holding. Were they tested?" Pendle looked up from his shears. They were. A faint residue of a chemical compound harmless in itself. Traces of talc, consistent with new leather gloves. But the size was odd. "Too small?" He nodded. "Definitely. Miss Masters had strong hands. These gloves would have fit someone with much finer fingers. A younger woman, perhaps." Dr. Pendle didn't answer, but the pause was telling. Miss Marple thanked him and continued on her way, pausing at the edge of the path to admire a cluster of blooming foxglove. Poisonous, of course, is digitalis purpurea. Beautiful and deadly. She wondered how many other dangerous things were disguised beneath pleasant appearances. When she returned home, she opened her notebook once more. Teaspoon. Doesn't match vicarage or vestry set. Gloves. Too small for Lydia. New, fine leather. Not gardening gloves. Charles had reason, but lacks detail. Isabel, anxious. Bracelet? Thin hands. She circled the word bracelet, underlined it once, then set the pen aside. That evening, while the village dined in their parlours, and the parlour-maids cleared away supper plates, Inspector Arkwright returned to the vicarage, his mood clearly fouled by the lack of progress. He found the Reverend pacing in the study, a glass of sherry untouched on the side table. "I understand Miss Masters had some influence here," the inspector began bluntly. Her voice carried weight. The vicar nodded wearily. She was dependable, a friend to the parish. Not always well liked, perhaps, but trusted. Trusted by all? The vicar hesitated, then sighed. There were whispers. She sometimes overstepped. She took it upon herself to correct what she saw as moral failings. Quietly, of course. But she had strong opinions. On your nephew, perhaps. Another pause. Longer this time. She believed Charles was in over his head, the vicar admitted. He borrowed more than he could repay, and there was a matter of affection. She thought him careless with young women's feelings, particularly Miss Hartley's. The vicar's gaze dropped to the floor. Perhaps. Isabel is young and impressionable. Lydia feared she'd be hurt. Arkwright leaned back in the armchair. Well then, we may have more than one motive. A financial debt and jealousy. That's a powerful combination. But even as the inspector pondered those possibilities across the village, Miss Marple stood at her window, looking out at the darkening sky. She thought of Isabel's bracelet, of the gloves too small for Lydia's hands, of a teaspoon that came from nowhere. Not yet a solution, but soon, soon. For the most dangerous lies she knew were not always spoken. They were placed, deliberately, quietly, just like a silver spoon in a cup of poisoned tea. By the end of the week, St. Mildred's was no longer merely curious. It was simmering. The murder of Lydia Masters had transformed the quiet village into a hive of speculation, suspicion, and subdued unrest. Conversations, once light and leisurely, now bristled with half-finished sentences and knowing glances. Even the birds seemed to sing more cautiously. Miss Marple, for her part, continued with her gentle routines, seemingly unaffected. She attended morning prayers, clipped her roses with quiet precision, and shared tea with Mrs. Banbury Scott as if nothing whatsoever had changed. But beneath her calm exterior, Miss Marple was listening. Listening, watching, and knitting together threads of truth spun by the people around Germany, none of whom had any idea how revealing they could be. On Friday morning, the silence was interrupted by raised voices from the vicarage garden. Miss Marple, from her parlour window, caught the tail end of a conversation Charles Denham and Isabel Hartley, standing stiffly by the greenhouse. Isabel's cheeks were flushed, her arms crossed tight across her chest. "You promised me, Charles," she said, the wind carrying her words to the hedges. "You said it would be different this time." "I never promised her anything," Charles replied, his voice low but urgent. "You know that. Whatever Lydia thought, it was her assumption, not mine. I don't care what she assumed. I care that you lied to me." "I didn't, Isabel, please." "You're not being fair." Isabel turned and strode away down the garden path, her thin shoulders trembling beneath her cardigan. Miss Marple made a thoughtful sound and turned away from the window. Later that afternoon, she paid a quiet visit to the village library, where the caretaker, Mr. Calthrop, was replacing old parish records in the back room. Mr. Calthrop was an unassuming fellow with a great fondness for sherry and crossword puzzles. Miss Marple found him to be an excellent source of information on village history, particularly the sort most people no longer spoke of aloud. She found him behind a leaning stack of hymnals, squinting at a faded ledger. "Miss Marple," he said, startled. "My word, you gave me a turn. I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Calthrop. I wonder if you might help me with a little question of family matters." He beamed. "Family matters are my specialty, if you ask the right ones." "I was thinking of Lydia Masters," she said gently. "You've lived here all your life, haven't you?" He nodded. "Nearly. Came here when I was 12. I remember Lydia quite well. She lived with her aunt back then. Miss Partridge is a stern old soul. Lydia inherited the house after she passed. Did Lydia have any family?" "Only a cousin, I believe. A woman named Sylvia Cartwright? Or was it Caro? Moved to Wales. Lydia stayed behind. No siblings. No nieces or nephews. None that I know of. Kept to herself. Always helping with the church, though. Took things seriously. She once scolded the baker's boy for whistling 'I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles' during communion." Miss Marple smiled politely, thanked him, and left. The breeze outside had picked up again, rustling the leaves into murmurs. Secrets, she thought, had a way of returning, even after years of silence. She did not return directly home. Instead, she turned toward the pharmacy on the corner of Halberd Lane. Mrs. Ridgway was restocking a display of cod liver oil capsules when Miss Marple entered. The bell over the door jingled like a warning. Miss Marple had not come for medicine. "Good day, Mrs. Ridgway," she said pleasantly. "I do hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," said the pharmacist's wife, pursing her lips. "Though if you're after valerian drops, we're all out. There's been quite a run on them since Miss Masters passed." Miss Marple chuckled softly. Human nerves are such fragile things. "But no, I'm actually hoping to trouble you with a memory." Mrs. Ridgway tilted her head, suspicious. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "someone mentioned to me that Miss Masters came in to collect a prescription last Tuesday, and I wondered if you recalled what it was." The woman hesitated, clearly weighing the ethics of such disclosure. "Nothing serious," she said at last. "Vitamin tablets and a mild sleep tonic. Harmless, really. No prescription medication, No, she said she preferred not to drug herself into a stupor, if I recall her words correctly. Very old-fashioned, Miss Masters. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, but remarkably precise in her habits. She always returned the library books on the same day and always took tea at 4. People like that, they notice things, even small ones. Mrs. Ridgway stiffened. I suppose so. Miss Marple left her with a thank you and a thoughtful nod. That evening, Inspector Arkwright returned to the village once more, this time accompanied by a young officer from the county lab. They had come with news from the toxicology report. The tea from Miss Masters' cup had indeed been poisoned, a substance derived from a conatine extracted from monkshood, bitter, easily masked by strong tea and lethal in small amounts. The inspector made a note of the findings, then sat with the vicar in the study. Does your garden contain monkshood? The vicar shook his head. No, certainly not. Too dangerous. We grow mostly roses and peonies. A few herbs, but nothing that might be so fatal. What about Miss Masters' garden? She had no garden to speak of, said the vicar. Just a few flower boxes. No monkshood. Arkwright nodded slowly, and yet someone had access to it. Miss Marple, later informed of the report through Constable Briggs, who had developed a habit of accidentally lingering near her gate, considered the implications with a calm that belied the seriousness of the news. Poison required thought, planning, opportunity, and it was not administered in a moment of passion, but of calculation. She returned to her notebook. Monkshood. Rare. Requires handling. Gloves? No garden. Where was it sourced? Gloves found on Lydia. Too small. Recently. Isabel's bracelet. Argument with Charles. But not about money. The bracelet continued to bother her. A simple silver chain. No charms. No engraving. Yet Isabel fidgeted with it whenever nervous, as if it held some deeper meaning. That night, a storm broke over St Mildred's. Rain lashed the eaves and thunder cracked over the hills, yet Miss Marple slept soundly, her mind steady in the storm. Morning would bring more questions, but the answers, she knew, were beginning to arrange themselves. Quietly, like figures stepping onto a stage before the curtain rose. And someone among them was beginning to falter under the weight of their own performance. The morning after the storm brought a different kind of stillness to St Mildred's. Not the tranquil hush of a village beginning its day, but the tight-laced silence of anticipation, as if the cobbled lanes and garden hedges had absorbed the previous night's thunder and now waited for the next crack to split the air. In Miss Marple's cottage, the windows were slightly ajar to let in the clean scent of wet earth and rain-washed ivy. She had risen early, as always, and was now seated at her writing desk, rereading the notes in her small leather-bound notebook. Aconitine, monkshood, source unknown, teaspoon mismatched, deliberate placement, gloves too small, not Lydia's, bracelet, Isabel. Behavior is increasingly anxious. Charles lied about the past with Lydia, but no true motive. Vicar, worried, but why not surprised? The last line was circled, not surprised. That, in Miss Marple's mind, was the strangest behavior of all. While grief could manifest in countless ways, the absence of shock in the Reverend's demeanor the day Lydia was found dead was not the natural reaction of a man discovering the sudden death of a dear friend, especially one he saw daily, who had once, it was whispered, harbored affections for him. The trouble with kind men, Miss Marple had often thought, was that they were very good at hiding what they didn't want others to see. Or know. But she tucked those thoughts away for now and turned her attention to a more pressing matter. Something had shifted in the village. The air was tight with it. And just after 10, the news broke. Constable Briggs, breathless and visibly shaken, arrived at the vicarage bearing word from Mrs. Finch, who had found the body. Not another murder, thank heavens, but a very serious development all the same. Mrs. Ridgway, the pharmacist's wife, had been found unconscious in her back garden, collapsed beside the rose trellis. The scene was peculiar, No injuries, no evidence of a fall. Her husband had summoned Dr. Pendle at once. Miss Marple was at the tea shop when the news reached her, and within 10 minutes the incident had become the chief topic of conversation throughout the village. Theories spun like windmills, some attributing it to nerves, others to guilt. One suggested she had known something all along and been poisoned to keep her silent. Miss Marple, sipping her tea slowly, remained quiet as the theories piled higher than the scones. Later that day, she paid a quiet visit to Dr. Pendle's surgery, where the doctor met her at the door with an exhausted expression. "She'll recover," he said without prompting. "Though she's fortunate. Aconitine again, but only a trace. Either a smaller dose or it didn't absorb fully." Miss Marple's eyes widened, though she did not pretend surprise. "So someone tried to silence her?" Dr. Pendle folded his arms. "Seems so. It was in her tea. Her husband said she took her morning cup on the back patio as usual. He brewed it, but the cup went untouched when he stepped away to answer the phone. When he returned, she was slumped in the chair. Where is the cup now? Taken by the inspector, sent for testing." Miss Marple nodded. "Tell me, did Mrs. Ridgway mention anything to you after Lydia's death? Something she remembered? Something unusual?" The doctor hesitated. "She came to me a few days ago," he admitted. "She said she had seen Lydia speaking to someone unexpected the night before the garden party, near the churchyard. Who? She didn't say anything. Claimed she couldn't be certain in the dim light, but she said she recognized the person's walk. I asked if she was sure. She only said, 'I'd stake my last bottle of castor oil on it.'" Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. She murmured her thanks and made her way back down the lane, her steps brisk, mind racing. Someone had known that Mrs. Ridgway had seen something. Someone had wanted to ensure her silence, but the attempt had been clumsy and rushed, a sign of desperation. And desperation, Miss Marple knew, was the doorway to mistakes. That evening, Inspector Arkwright called a closed-door meeting at the vicarage. The Reverend, Charles, Isabel, and even the shaken Mr. Ridgway were asked to attend. Miss Marple was invited as well, though she took her usual seat at the edge of the room, knitting in her lap, appearing only vaguely attentive. Arkwright stood before them, arms crossed, the teaspoon resting on the side table beside him. "We now know that the substance that killed Miss Masters was aconitine, most likely extracted from fresh monkshood, and we have reason to believe that the same substance was used in an attempt to poison Mrs. Ridgway." He let that settle over the room. "There are no monkshood plants in Miss Masters' home, nor at the vicarage. But," he continued, "there are several such plants growing in the grounds behind the old schoolhouse, long neglected, overgrown, and accessible to anyone." He turned to Charles. "You said you hadn't ventured beyond the village square since your arrival." Charles frowned. "I haven't." Arkwright raised an eyebrow. "Then how do you explain your fingerprints found on a tin box recovered from the schoolhouse garden? A box containing dried monkshood petals." Charles looked stunned. "I've no idea how they got there." "That's not a particularly strong defense," the inspector said, "especially when paired with your history of deceit regarding Miss Masters and the argument you had just hours before her death." From her chair, Miss Marple looked up. Her knitting needle stilled. "If I may," she said, so softly that it took a moment for the others to hear her. The inspector hesitated, then gave a nod. Miss Marple turned to Charles, her eyes kind. "You didn't handle that tin box recently, did you?" He shook his head quickly. "I swear I didn't. I haven't been near the schoolhouse. Then I imagine your prints came from before? Perhaps Miss Masters kept it. You knew her in London, after all. Perhaps even shared tea in her flat." Arkwright turned. "Miss Marple, what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," she said calmly, "that this entire case has been built on careful deception. The teaspoon was placed to mislead. The gloves planted. The poison is subtle, yes, but all the more dangerous for its subtlety. She turned to Isabel. "My dear, do you remember the bracelet you wore the day of the garden party?" Isabel blinked. "Yes. What about it? You're not wearing it now." "No, I lost it. Or removed it," Miss Marple said gently, "because you realized someone had seen it. Mrs. Ridgway, perhaps. That bracelet, fine silver, a gift, wasn't it?" Isabel's lips parted. "Yes. From Lydia. Which she found again, I suspect," Miss Marple continued. "Perhaps on the ground near the old schoolhouse garden. Perhaps she realized what it meant, and perhaps that was the final piece she needed. Enough to confront you." "Eno," Isabel stammered. "That's not what happened." "She misunderstood. I didn't mean she never told anyone, did she?" Miss Marple's voice was like a breeze over glass. "Not even Charles. You followed her home, you made her tea, and you made sure she drank it." Silence. Then Isabel crumpled into the chair, her face white. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. "I only wanted her to stop. She said she'd ruin everything. She always judged me because she thought I wasn't good enough, that I was leading Charles on." Charles stood frozen. The vicar closed his eyes in sorrow. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "I rather think Lydia knew more about human nature than people gave her credit for," she said softly. "And when she died, she tried to point us to the truth in the only way she could, by holding the gloves. Too small for her. The gloves of a younger woman." Inspector Arkwright, for once, said nothing. He only nodded to his constable. Miss Marple stood. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rustling the trees in the vicarage garden, and somewhere in the church tower a single bell tolled, not for the dead this time, but for the truth that had finally stepped into the light. Despite the confession whispered into the stunned silence of the vicarage study, the matter was not closed. Not for Inspector Arkwright, who preferred inked statements and signed affidavits, and not for Miss Marple, who understood, far better than most, that human truths seldom revealed themselves so neatly or so willingly. That evening the village buzzed in low murmurs. Doors closed softly but stayed ajar just long enough to glimpse the faces peering out. The news had traveled. Isabel Hartley had admitted something. Not quite guilty, not quite innocent. And that was the problem. She said she didn't mean for it to happen, Mrs. Hemmings relayed to a wide-eyed Mrs. Finch at the tea shop. But she didn't deny it either, and now she's staying with her cousin in Much Barton. Left just before supper. She ran, you mean? Mrs. Finch replied grimly. The guilty always do. Miss Marple had made no such pronouncement. She spent the morning after the confrontation quietly, weeding the borders of her garden and sipping weak tea. But inwardly, her mind pressed against the edges of doubt. Something remained unresolved. Isabel's tears had been real, her fear too. But guilt, true guilt, was like mildew behind wallpaper. It left stains even after a surface was cleaned. And Miss Marple saw none of those stains in Isabel's reaction. There had been panic, yes, and desperation. But what had she truly admitted to? Only that Lydia had confronted her, that there had been pressure, threats, and judgments, that Lydia had spoken of destroying her reputation, her engagement, and her hopes, but not that Isabel had killed her. Not precisely. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk to the churchyard. Not to visit a grave, but to observe the path between the rear garden gate and the overgrown patch near the abandoned schoolhouse. It was there, beside the old stone wall, that the monkshood still grew violet and blue like stained glass in wild bloom. Dangerous, yes, but also distinct. She knelt to inspect the base of the plants. Someone had been here recently. The broken stems, crushed leaves, and a faint impression in the damp earth suggested as much. One shoe print, narrow, small. Not Charles, certainly. As she rose to her feet, she heard footsteps approaching from the lane. "Miss Marple," called Inspector Arkwright, looking unusually winded. "There you are. I've been hoping to find you." She dusted her hands on her gloves. "Then fortune is on your side." The inspector chuckled, then lowered his voice. "There's been an update. Forensics came back with more detail about the tea found beside Mrs. Ridgway. The poison was very poorly mixed, clumped, inconsistent. It's likely whoever administered it had very little experience with preparation." Miss Marple gave a soft as though considering the rainfall. "Amateurs are often more dangerous than professionals," she said gently, "especially when their hand is guided by emotion." Arkwright nodded. "There's something else. We found a letter. Lydia Masters had it locked in her desk. We only just got access to it. It's addressed to the vicar, unsent." Miss Marple turned her full attention on him now. "Oh." It outlines her concerns about Charles's growing closeness to Isabel. She believed Isabel was manipulating him. She even suggested that Isabel had lied about her family background, that her mother was not in fact from good stock, but had once worked in service. Miss Marple's eyes did not blink. That would have distressed Lydia very much. It might have also provided a motive. Though that brings us back to Isabel, unless she wasn't the one who read the letter first. Miss Marple smiled slightly. "An interesting idea, Inspector. And if I might offer a thought of my own?" "Please." "I would like to host a small tea party. A quiet affair. Just yourself, the Reverend Charles, and Mrs. Weatherby. I believe it might help clarify a few matters." Arkwright stared. "Tea?" Miss Marple's voice was mild as a breeze. "One must sometimes observe the ripples to understand the stone." The next day, at 4 o'clock sharp, Miss Marple welcomed her guests to her modest cottage, where the scent of lemon cake and rose hip jam floated gently on the summer air. The sitting room was neatly arranged with a tea tray at the center, flanked by comfortable chairs and the good china gleaming. Reverend Arbuthnot arrived first, looking apologetic and slightly nervous. Charles came next, dressed formally, though the shadows beneath his eyes hinted at many sleepless nights. Mrs. Weatherby, ever brisk, wore her best hat and sat stiffly, as if unsure whether this was a social call or trial. Inspector Arkwright arrived last, taking the chair opposite Miss Marple. "Now then," she began pleasantly, pouring tea. "It's such a blessing to find moments of calm, don't you think? The village has been so unsettled." "Understandably," murmured the vicar, accepting a cup with trembling hands. Miss Marple served the others before returning to her chair. "Do forgive me if I speak plainly," she said, setting down the teapot. "I asked you here because I believe a great wrong has been done, and because I believe someone in this room holds the final key to understanding Lydia Masters' death." No one moved. A teacup clinked softly. "I don't mean to speak ill of the dead," Miss Marple continued, but Lydia was not without her faults. She judged others harshly. She pried, perhaps more than she ought, but she was, above all, methodical, deliberate. So when she was found with gloves too small for her, clutching them even in death, I knew she had left a message. The vicar frowned. "A message?" "Yes. You see, Lydia knew she was dying, or suspected it. She had taken the tea, tasted something bitter, perhaps, and realized too late what had happened. But she had the presence of mind to leave a clue." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. She held those gloves because they were not hers, because she had found them or been given them by someone she knew, a woman with fine hands, someone who had recently visited her. She turned to Mrs. Weatherby. "And you, madam, have remarkably fine hands." The housekeeper blinked, taken aback. "I didn't understand. Lydia wrote a letter she never posted, but someone else read it, someone who realized what it would mean if it reached the vicar. and someone who feared Lydia might say what she might uncover if she continued to pry. Mrs. Weatherby's colour drained. "You're suggesting I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said quietly, "that Lydia knew about your son." Silence fell like a dropped plate. Mrs. Weatherby stared. "No one knows about him. But Lydia did," Miss Marple said gently. "He was in trouble. There was a theft. Not here, but at his employer's in Norwich. Lydia had a way of discovering such things, and she threatened to go to the vicar, to ask that your son be removed from the church's outreach fund." Mrs. Weatherby's lips trembled. She said she would ruin him. He'd only just found work again. I begged her. "You visited her that evening," Miss Marple said softly. "You wore gloves, the same gloves she would clutch in her final moments. You brought tea, as you always did, and you added something to it." Mrs. Weatherby's breath came shallow now. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. I only wanted to scare her. A small dose, just to make her ill." She wouldn't listen. "And later," Miss Marple continued, "when you realized the gloves were missing, you panicked. You thought Isabel had taken them. Or Charles. Or perhaps even the vicar." Mrs. Weatherby looked down at her tea. "I didn't think she would keep them." "She did," said Miss Marple. "Because even in death, Lydia Masters could not leave a mystery unresolved." Inspector Arkwright stood, slowly. There was no need to say anything more. The truth had landed, soft and heavy, and it hung in the room like smoke. Outside, the wind stirred the lilacs. A bird sang, and Miss Marple reached for the teapot once more. "Another cup, Inspector? I believe we've earned it." It was just past 6 o'clock when Mrs. Weatherby, still wearing her best hat, was quietly led out of Miss Marple's cottage by Inspector Arkwright. The last light of the day bathed the lane in honeyed gold, and for a moment all was still. No words were exchanged. There were no handcuffs, no protests, no dramatic pronouncements, only the slow steps of a woman who had carried a secret too long and had finally laid it down. Inside the cottage, silence lingered even after the door shut. Miss Marple poured the last of the tea into her own cup, then lifted the pot to find it empty. She smiled faintly, as though that too had been foretold. Charles Denham was the first to speak, his voice rough with disbelief. "She poisoned Lydia for the sake of her son?" Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes, a mother's instinct can be both tender and terrifying." Mrs. Weatherby believed she was protecting him from scandal, from unemployment, and from disgrace. In doing so, she convinced herself that a small dose would only make Lydia ill, just long enough to frighten her into silence. But she miscalculated, the Reverend said quietly, standing near the window with one hand resting on the frame. She didn't understand how strong aconitine is. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "or how unpredictable it can be when mixed incorrectly." Lydia must have recognized something was wrong the moment she tasted the tea. Bitterness, numbness in the mouth, symptoms she was likely familiar with. She read herbal medicine pamphlets, you know. She tried to signal the danger, clutching the gloves that didn't belong to her. The vicar nodded slowly, as if remembering something unspoken. "She was always a watcher," he said, "always noticed details, and never forgot a slight." "She didn't deserve to die," Charles murmured. "She may have meddled, but she didn't deserve this." "No one does," said Miss Marple, folding her hands in her lap. "But justice, I think, has taken its course, however quiet that course may have been." The sitting room settled into a thoughtful hush. Outside, the wind had calmed, the sky brushed with the dusky lavender of evening. The bell from the church tower tolled once, a single solemn note that drifted across the rooftops and hedges like a benediction. "Will she be arrested?" Charles asked eventually. "I expect Inspector Arkwright will speak to the magistrate," said Miss Marple. "There are circumstances to consider." She confessed. She cooperated. And above all, the motive, however misguided, was rooted in fear, not malice. "Still," murmured the Reverend, "it is a terrible thing." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Terrible, yes, but not without precedent. I've seen it before in different villages, under different guises. People driven by love or pride or shame. It's human, you know, to justify the unthinkable, especially when done for someone we love." Charles rubbed his eyes, and the vicar poured him a fresh cup of tea from the new pot Mrs. Marple had set out. No one had much appetite, but it seemed wrong to sit in silence. After a few minutes, Miss Marple turned her gaze toward Charles. "You've had a difficult few weeks, Mr. Denham." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "More than I ever expected. I came here for rest, not for suspicion and scandal." "You must be grateful to Miss Masters, then," she said lightly. Charles blinked. "Grateful?" "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple. Had she not made such a point of that teaspoon, placing it deliberately by her cup, you might have been the one arrested. It was a very clever misdirection on the real culprit's part, but Lydia corrected it in her own way. Charles looked down at his tea. The cup trembled slightly in his hand. "I suppose I didn't realize how close I came." "Most people don't," she said. "That's the trouble with village life. Everything is close to truth and fiction, guilt and innocence. It takes a trained eye to tell them apart." "And what of Isabel?" the vicar asked softly. "She left so suddenly." "She panicked," Miss Marple said. "She thought the weight of suspicion would bury her, but I rather think she'll return in time. People often do, once the dust has settled." Charles stared out the window. "I hope so," he said. "We weren't perfect, Isabel and I, but I do care for her." "I believe she knows that," Miss Marple said, "and perhaps, in her own way, so did Lydia." The conversation drifted into silence once more, the air heavy with thoughts too large to speak aloud. Eventually, Miss Marple rose. "Well, I shall not keep you any longer. There is still supper to think of and the post to fetch, and I have a feeling the roses in my front bed are being strangled by that stubborn, creeping mint again." The vicar and Charles took their leave shortly after. Outside, the hush of twilight descended over St. Mildred's, the kind that only followed a storm after it had fully spent itself. Miss Marple remained behind, tidying the tea things with her usual meticulousness. Her cottage was still, her mind quiet. She sat once more at her writing desk and drew out the notebook. She flipped past pages of inked deductions and finally wrote one last note. The final motive is fear and maternal instinct. Key clue: gloves, deliberate. True villain, none. Only flawed, frightened people. She paused, then wrote another line beneath it. Justice tempered with mercy is often the most just of all. The next morning the village seemed to breathe again. Children played in the green. Mr. Jellicoe returned to his habit of singing tunelessly while arranging apples. Mrs. Hemmings whispered the latest tale to Mrs. Finch, though now it was more a story than a scandal. And Miss Marple, as was her way, strolled to the post office and back, nodding gently to neighbors, pausing at a rose bush to pinch off a dying bloom. The riddle of the teaspoon had been solved. The murder was uncovered, and life, with all its brittleness and beauty, had returned to its familiar rhythm. But beneath it all, she knew the truth was rarely simple. It was fragile, layered, and human. And it often sat just beyond reach, waiting for someone quiet and curious enough to bring it to light. With that thought, Miss Marple returned to her garden, set down her gloves, and knelt to pull the mint from her roses. After all, the village needed tending, and so did the truth. The summer sun returned in full the following week, as if determined to remind the people of St. Mildred's that life, despite its twists and tragedies, must go on. The hedgerows bloomed again, The scent of honeysuckle and new-mown grass drifted over the low stone walls, and the hum of bees rejoined the rhythm of village life. To the casual observer, all seemed as it should be, but beneath the surface, a subtle shift had taken place. Not a fracture, but a fine realignment, as if the village had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. Mrs. Ridgway had returned to her duties behind the counter of the pharmacy, albeit with a noticeably gentler tone when addressing customers. The near brush with death had clearly left its mark. She no longer cut off Mrs. Hemmings mid-sentence nor barked at Mr. Jellicoe for blocking the aisle with his potato sacks. Inspector Arkwright had left for Much Barton, his role completed, his notes neatly filed, and his mind likely already shifting to the next unsolved case in some far less picturesque parish. But not before paying a quiet visit to Miss Marple's cottage. "I must say, Miss Marple," he remarked with a half-smile as he accepted a final cup of tea, "you've taught me something." "Oh," she said, pouring milk into his cup. "And what might that be?" "That a teaspoon," he said, pausing for effect, "can be more dangerous than a revolver when wielded properly." Miss Marple gave a modest smile, folding her hands in her lap. "It's not the weapon that matters, Inspector. It's who picks it up and why." The day after the inspector's departure, Charles Denham packed his suitcase. He stood for a long time outside the vicarage, gazing at the gate as if reluctant to pass through it. The vicar joined him with a hand gently clasped on his shoulder. "You'll always have a place here, Charles." "Despite everything." Charles managed a tight smile. "Thank you, Uncle. I just need a fresh start. Somewhere I can build something without shadows hanging over it." The vicar nodded, and after a few more quiet words, Charles walked away down the lane with a leather valise in one hand, and the weight of his recent past carried, perhaps, a little lighter than before. Miss Marple watched him from the edge of her garden, her sun hat tilted just so against the morning light. She gave a small wave. Charles returned it with a polite nod, and then he was gone off to London or some country post, or wherever young men with quiet hearts and complicated memories go. As for Isabel Hartley, she did indeed return quietly, without fuss, slipping into the pews at Sunday service and sitting 3 rows from the back. She kept her head bowed and her eyes downcast, but not from shame. Rather, it was as if she were learning to see the world again from a new angle. It was Miss Banbury Scott who extended the olive branch first, inviting her for tea one afternoon in full view of the green. No one dared comment, though eyebrows were raised behind lace curtains. Slowly, Isabel's presence ceased to stir whispers. She took on a position at the school, assisting with music lessons, and though her laugh was a touch quieter than before, it rang with an honesty that hadn't been there during the summer parties. And Mrs. Weatherby, she did not return. The vicar, after a week of reflection and prayer, issued a small notice in the parish newsletter explaining that Mrs. Weatherby had retired due to health concerns and had gone to stay with her sister in Cornwall. It was a simple explanation, free from detail. No mention was made of Lydia Masters, or of the gloves or the tea. Miss Marple read it over her breakfast toast and marmalade and found it exactly as it should be. The village, after all, did not need every truth spoken aloud. And so St. Mildred settled into the gentler lanes of August. Harvest baskets appeared at doorsteps. Children chased each other along the green, and dogs napped contentedly in shaded corners. The riddle of the teaspoon became something of a tale passed in whispers, altered with each telling. Some claimed it had been poisoned in the jam. Others insisted the spoon had vanished entirely, spirited away by a ghostly hand. But those who had truly watched were those who had listened to Saatchi understood the deeper story. Not a story about murder, really, but about fear and pride, and the dangerous kindnesses people offer in silence when they believe they have no other choice. One warm afternoon, Miss Marple received a letter neatly folded, addressed in a fine, steady hand. It read, "Dear Miss Marple, I owe you thanks. Not only for the truth, but for how gently you revealed it. I'm not certain what lies ahead, but I think of you, and I might find the courage to face it. With gratitude, Isabel Miss Marple placed the letter in a small box atop her writing desk, where she kept other mementos. A pressed violet from a case in Devon, a train ticket from a journey to Yorkshire, and a photograph of her late nephew smiling in the snow. That evening, as the bells chimed 7 from the church tower, she took her usual stroll. The shadows stretched long across the lanes, and the windows of the cottages glowed with lamplight and the smell of supper. As she passed Lydia Master's cottage, now shuttered and awaiting probate, she paused at the gate. The flower boxes were still there, the blooms slightly overgrown now, though not yet wild. She bent to pluck a weed from the stone path, then straightened and looked up at the sky. "It's always the small things," she murmured, "that carry the biggest truths." A bird trilled in the hawthorn tree above. A dog barked distantly from a neighboring lane, and Miss Marple continued on, her footsteps soft and certain along the path she knew so well. For in the quiet heart of England, where lace curtains flutter and teacups clink, justice does not always arrive with sirens or trials. Sometimes it comes with a teaspoon, and sometimes with a woman in a sun hat who sees more than anyone thinks and says far less than she knows. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit her lamp, set the kettle to boil, and pulled out her embroidery. Another mystery had ended, but she, as ever, remained ready for the next.